Welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of Beardies Assemble. I'm joined by Rory and Samir, and the sort of mission statement, if you will, of this is diving into nerd culture, but tying it in with business. And for the first episode, we've decided to dive into a big one, which is the MCU, so the Marvel Cinematic Universe, what's next for them, as well as what other businesses can learn from their triumphs, mistakes, and as well their marketing strategies. So Rory and Samir, welcome as well.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you very much, John. It's nice to be here with you guys. Loving the beards, by the way.
Are you going to braid it? Because that's my plan.
I don't know. I might be inspired by Thor's braid.
Yes.
In Endgame. So let's see what happens. And I'm clearly putting on the pounds as well. So
living that Thor life, getting that Thor bod, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a lot more achievable now.
So I guess to put a spoiler notice, just in case anyone forgot that the spoiler ban has been lifted, we are going to talk about Endgame and what follows. So if you haven't seen it yet, pause it, see it, then return and continue listening. And I think if we're going to talk about, the business side of it, that's a brilliant marketing strategy as well. The fact that they announced before their second weekend, actually on Monday, the spoiler ban is lifted because there's going to be a trailer with all these spoilers. I got calls from a couple of friends saying, have you seen it yet? I need to see it this weekend. I cannot get spoiled. And I guess a lot of people that were just so afraid of it being spoiled for them rushed to the cinemas to see it before that point. So from a marketing perspective, it's a brilliant way of basically they're saying for the first week, they're saying, please do not spoil it. Do not spoil it. Then they go, we're going to spoil it. Go see it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think, there's a few little strokes of genius that they've had over the years, with the original first films having those end credit scenes. That was something, that people would wait around for. And it was the promo for, either the next movie or some sort of hidden secret. And I think that was a really smart move to add those in there. Of course, it's harking back to the days of original cinema when they used to do the trailers used to be at the end. That's why they were called trailers. So it was sort of bringing that back again, which I thought was a really smart move. Really smart marketing moves. Yeah.
Well, to pile on some more nerdery to that, I'd actually say that it reaches a lot further back than that. Because if you look at Arabian Nights, it's a whole story about someone who manages to stay alive by keeping the king busy and excited about stories, because she always tells him one story and then starts another one and stops before. She always ends on a cliffhanger so that he has to come the next day, see it, come the next day, and I think that's what Marvel has done really well. Even people that weren't massively into, superhero movies or sci-fi or anything, they just bought into the characters and they cared enough to sit through the whole credit sequence. They cared enough to see 22 movies to see it finish its arc. And even in Endgame, if you think about it, the last 8 to 15 minutes is basically the post-credit scene. It's setting up the next arcs. It's setting up Sam as Captain America. It's setting up, Thor as part of the Guardians of the Galaxy. They really did everything they would have done in a post-credit scene there. They teased what's coming next, and I think that's a brilliant move to make as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it reminded me of Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, and their multiple endings they had at the end. But still, I was emotionally so invested in that, considering I had watched the 2 previous films the night before. So I was on that journey once again with them. And but that's a brilliant reference when you're talking about the Arabian Nights and how they did it. But I think, again, it was, there's some integral figures that I think that made it work. And Russo brothers definitely had it, and Kevin Feige for having the overall vision of all of this. But then at the same time, having, which is quite rare in business, learning their lessons quite early on. And because there was issues at the beginning of the MCU in terms of some of the stories, particularly around Thor, and it wasn't getting that traction. And they were brave. Well, Kevin Feige was brave enough to go and say, okay, we need to go on a bit of a course correction here. And he kind of let the reins, because they were known to be quite restrictive or quite controlling. But they let the reins happen, and they let the directors do what they want to express themselves. But then I say it's kudos to the Russo brothers, who had this ability to weave all the individual stories together and then create it into a narrative at these linchpin moments of the Avengers, which was, I thought, was bloody amazing. And it's difficult for me to see any other directors that could potentially do that to make it land as much as it did, whilst exploiting the potential strengths of individual directors, say like Taika Waititi or James Gunn, and their particular narrative style, which was all individually great, but then to be able to pull on that and then to combine it, it's been amazing.
Yeah, I think what they've done is massively impressive. You know, not only have they launched, you know, individual successful franchises, you know, and you know, billions of dollars at the box office and of course on merchandising, but they've done what no other franchise has really successfully done before. They've essentially serialized film.
Yes.
You know, granted, there are some films that have got connections and crossovers and stuff, but a consistent story arc over a decade, that's impressive. That's really, really impressive. And they've done it, you know, they've found a formula that works, because I think we've seen how hard it is to get it right. You know, if you look at the failed Amazing Spider-Man reboots, and you look at DC continually hitting the brick wall with Man of Steel, Justice League, and Aquaman, bar, of course, you know, Wonder Woman and Shazam, we've seen how hard it is. And for them to be able to pull off, you know, a serialization of film and do it well, it's so impressive. It's really, really impressive. And I think that's where it comes to that point of they're kind of at the top of their game now. Where do they go from here? What's next? And I think they're going to certainly take a beat and take a breather, but I don't think there's any reason why they can't essentially restart that process again and set up another a 10-year arc. But I think the smart move for them now is probably to make lots of small bets, and just tweak and have a look and see what works. I think that's probably the immediate term play, because they've got some films scheduled coming up, but nothing to what they had previously.
And I think as well, if they do what they did before, like you're saying, I think it'll have almost a different flavor to it, because everyone knows what their formula is. Because if you think about it now, if people look back to Iron Man 1 or, you know, the first Thor, they'll definitely start seeing some signals of things that were important later on. And, you know, when people saw Guardians of the Galaxy for the first time, they probably didn't think, yes, Peter Quill's getting something that will eventually be a part of a gauntlet that will end humanity. Except if people were very well versed in the comics. But even people who aren't, in this next upcoming sort of plethora of films, if they start hiding those little tidbits that might point to, let's say, a Secret Wars story arc, people will start picking up on it a lot quicker, because the internet rumor mill will be spinning out so many ideas and thoughts, and already are. So really, like you're saying, I think those small bets is really where it's at for them, but they have to make sure that it does tie into something bigger, because I think that's what's kept them rolling, even through some of the admittedly weaker films. Even when, you know, Thor 2 didn't get the roaring applause that some of the other films got, but people saw it, and it ended up being quite important in the grand scheme of things, because it included references to the Infinity Stones, because it had those connections.
I agree. I mean, with that as well, it's funny, I was just reflecting on Captain America's arc. I didn't like the first Avenger. That Captain America story I thought it was quite boring, to be honest. It's only afterwards, after Winter Soldier and Civil War, I loved him. He's one of my favorite characters now, and they had to go through that. And I think the same issue I've got with Captain Marvel as well. Just there's not much resonance there. But saying all of this, I don't know. I don't know if they can repeat the success that they've had. And if you think about it, it's been quite an emotional investment for people, and it's been over 10 years. That's almost like a generation of people. And you're thinking about, there's an option there to kind of say, am I going to really be bothered to go and invest in it now again? Because it was fresh and new with Iron Man. It was something completely different. None of us had seen it. It was first time we're seeing all these superheroes to life. Now we've got to a point where it's just common now. Superheroes are common. People are aware of that. I don't know if they'll be able to repeat that as big a success. I mean, am I going to be as much invested in these new characters, which they're bringing out, as much as not? Am I going to be willing to give another 10 years of myself kind of thing. I don't know. I probably will, because we're just nerds at the end of the day. But from speaking, because it had captured quite a larger audience, I would say, I don't know if they'll be able to repeat that same success. Definitely they can be braver with exploring the more different stories. They're going into space a lot more now with the what's it called? The Eternals? Is it the Eternals?
Yeah.
The Eternals, that's the story that they're planning to do, and other potential areas. And there's no real talk yet, and I guess we'll find that out in Comic-Con when they're going to announce potential X-Men or Fantastic Four involvement. But yeah, I don't know if they've kind of reached their peak and whether we're going to see that kind of level of achievement again.
Well, I wonder if the impact will as well be, you know, I don't know whether they'll reach quite that peak again, but I wonder if the characters that are still living, because they don't really need to do more origin stories for quite a while now, because people are already invested in these characters. So even if they're not making $2 billion per film, surely they can still manage to remain wildly profitable and continue this serialization in a slightly different manner, because they don't have to build a world. The world is there now.
I think that's interesting, because I was thinking, you know, have we reached superhero fatigue? And I think that there is a slight sense of that, but I think superhero films, it's not to say that they won't work anymore, but I think they'll always be around because they fit into that sort of action adventure sci-fi genre. That those tropes are always going to be there. But I think what audiences are really hungry for is a different type of storytelling formula. Just, you know, like, it was so refreshing when Guardians of the Galaxy came along. It was just so different to all the other superhero films.
Yeah.
It was just a different style, and they did that again with Thor Ragnarok. It was that kind of fun, different style. And I think if they find that again, they can at least milk that for a period of time. But I think that's going to be the turning point for them is how they find that style, because I don't think they could wait and then start all over again doing the same kind of style again. I don't think that would work. So they're going to need to find that. And I think a lot of the effort right now for them is probably going to be put towards Disney's streaming service, Disney Plus, and all those many serializations. I think they're going to try and have a bit of play with there and see what's working and what people are interacting with, because there's some kind of weird little duo pairings that they've picked out there. Which will be interesting to see, because nobody had ever heard of Guardians of the Galaxy before. You know, the mainstream audience, they had no idea what it was, and it was a big hit. So I think there's certainly some interesting things in there, but they'll need to play it differently than they have done before.
Yeah, and I think even taking it to the complete opposite direction and playing around with more serious films as well. Like if you look at Winter Soldier, when that came out, that felt fresh in a completely different way. It wasn't light and sort of fluffy. It was serious. It felt almost like, you know, a spy thriller more so than it felt a superhero film. And I'd love to see them explore that in a way that still, I realize that they're not going to make, you know, an R-rated Captain America film or something, but, you know, if they sort of find that balance, that would be quite interesting. But I think, you know, moving over to sort of the business side of things in terms of, I guess, the successes, the struggles, because Samir, you mentioned they learned quite quickly how to respond and how to react to those struggles. So what do you think is a good parallel with a business in a completely different sector that's had a similar, I guess, career or trajectory as the MCU has?
I wouldn't say there's someone exactly like that, but I was just reading recently about Microsoft and how it's now, you know, $1 trillion company, and it's regained its kind of coolness and prestige again, from back in the day when Bill Gates was around, and how the leader, the CEO Satya Nadella, how he transformed it, but he transformed this big massive beast internally, and there's so many doing a topic on him is I think worthwhile looking at, but he's transformed it from internal. He had to change his massive old-fashioned kind of business organization of Microsoft into something kind of much more sleeker and fresher, and it's going into a completely different direction. And I see that what the blessing being is that what Kevin Feige did, which I thought was good, and I think leaders need to be doing, is is recognizing when they are going down a path where it's, you know what, we need to change, and something that Steve Jobs did. He was just a natural disruptor, and and being aware of the potential pitfalls. And it's like taking, for example, if we take the other parallel to DC, where it's been too late for them to kind of course correct, and they go and have been. It's just the way they handle it. I think there's a massive lesson in how to handle when things go bad, or when things go crap, or when things go shit, which happens in an organization, depending on your product life cycle, and depending on even whatever scale it is. You can be selling the most simplest of products and going, and it's just carrying on. How do we make it more innovative, or how do we change it, or how can we make it more fresh? And those same principles apply, but it requires a certain type of mindset, which I feel Kevin Feige is a great example of someone who's doing that whilst not taking fully control over it, though it's still more questionable now with Disney being the overall owner. Don't know how much of that's still going to play, or they're still going to give him the full flex of Marvel to go and do what he wants, or is Disney influence going to be there now? Are we going to start seeing more, I don't know, kiddish type stories, and you kind of see a bit of that happening maybe in Star Wars, the Star Wars franchise. The core element of it is kind of missing, and I don't know how much of that is to do with the corporate structure and strategy and influence compared to the person's original vision. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it totally makes sense, especially sort of Disney's in a very similar position to Apple. Apple doesn't really want to make R-rated content. They don't want to go hardcore. They like to be family friendly. They like to be that all-encompassing for every audience. And Disney's is going to have that same problem. They're not going to be as able or as agile to make those R-rated versions of the films that we all want to see. So they're in a slightly difficult predicament there, because you've got to appease, you know, the board and the shareholders and make sure that everybody's happy with the type of content that you're putting out there. And I think what you said, Samir, about Satya Nadella is so accurate, because he came into a company that was resting on its laurels. It was still very much the old Windows of old. And if you look at it now, I would argue that it's much more innovative, like what Apple used to be. They're coming out with really innovative products. They're really switching things up, and they're much more concerned about user experience and adding value to that. They launched their apps for Outlook on iOS devices. A couple of years ago, you would have thought that would be impossible. And as they clearly said, we want to launch and be where our consumers are. So it's a complete shift in mindset of the age-old, Microsoft with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. It's a completely different world. And I think, Microsoft's an excellent example of a complete course correction, massive course correction, and they've done it really well. You look at DC and they've really struggled. They've really, really struggled. And I don't think they learned the lessons. If you look at Man of Steel and then the follow-up Batman vs. Superman, they just didn't learn any of the lessons from the previous film. And then with a just utter disaster, Suicide Squad, it was just failing after failing after failing. And that's clearly a sign of mismanagement and people not learning from previous mistakes. So that I think there's so much to take from that, and so many companies and businesses that are continually making the same mistakes. And as that age-old, saying goes, it's the way we've always done it. It's a terrifying phrase. This is how we've always done it. It's a scary phrase. And Microsoft is very lucky to have someone like Satya Nadella come in there and shake things up. So yeah, good parallels with that, I think.
And I think as well, Apple is a great parallel, especially because you can so easily compare, DC, Marvel, Microsoft, Apple. But one that I thought of as well while we were talking is Nintendo. Nintendo had a winning streak of, the NES, the SNES, the Game Boy, Nintendo 64, but then had a bit of a struggle around the GameCube because the PS2 just dominated. Then they came out with the Wii and it just blew up in a completely different audience than the Wii U, but they've always sort of bounced back from these. It's almost like win this generation, lose the next. And it's been this way for a couple of cycles. But I genuinely wonder now, with the Nintendo Switch being as big as it is, how long can they, to say the same as you said, Rory, rest on their laurels with things like Mario, Zelda, which are becoming very formulaic, or have been very formulaic for a long time. And I genuinely wonder, similar to Marvel, what's next for them? Will they just release another console with the same type of games, or will they open their doors to either more third-party involvement, or even shift their focus more on opening their games to other platforms, seeing as, for example, Microsoft have now released Xbox Live for Nintendo Switch, as odd as that sounds. So I think there are a lot of interesting parallels that we could probably spend hours diving into. But
yes, let's do it.
Yeah. but I think actually it could be a good time to start wrapping up and really know what any of the listeners out there think about this. What do you think would be the best next step for the MCU? But also, what parallels do you see, and what lessons could businesses learn from the marketing genius of the MCU?